listeners. We have Janice Gassam Asare. Did I get that right, Janice?
Yes, you did.
Okay, perfect. Janice has been with us before talking about her book, Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace. It was a few years ago, so much has changed. And Janice is back with a new book, Rise and Resist: How to Reclaim Workplace Equity and Justice, which we will dig into today. It's action-packed with strategies, stories, and it reminds us that we've been through hard things before and we can get through this hard world as well. A bit about Jana. She's the founder of BWG Business Solutions, a consultancy designed to create cultures built on equity. She's collaborated with Google, Amazon, Yale, Nordstrom, H&M, PayPal, Venmo, so many more. She's also the author of other books like Dirty Diversity, The Pink Elephant, and Decentering Whiteness. She is the senior contributing author for Forbes, having authored over 500 articles, woo woo, Harvard Business Review contributor, and a LinkedIn learning instructor. She's also a LinkedIn top voice and a two times TEDx speaker and adjunct professor at Columbia. Janice, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Julie, for having me back. It's great to see you and great to chat with you today.
Yeah, so tell us about the new book, Rise and Resist. Everyone get a copy. I love how it's chock full of like historical examples of times when we have felt maybe just, I don't know if it's just like a futileness or like powerlessness that a lot of us are feeling right now. Rightfully so. It's been really hard. You and I, as DEI practitioners, have, our businesses have been affected, and yet we continue to show up. So tell me, like, why now? Like, why this message of rise and resist?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, really at the end of 2024, after the election, I started like so many, like you, like so many people, I started to see the writing on the wall. And I started to think about, okay, what is going to happen to DEI work? Because I remember the last time that this administration was in office, like right on his way out, Trump had implemented a diversity training ban on
Hmm.
federal agencies. And I just remember how disastrous that was just for the like 1 month that was implemented before Joe Biden ended up winning the 2020 election. And I started thinking about like what we need to do to prepare ourselves for this moment, those of us in like equity work and change work. And I actually wrote this thing called the DEI Resistance Playbook for all of the DEI resistance that those of us doing this work would experience. And an editor that I had worked with in the past saw an email I sent out and he was like, this would be a great book. So he reached out to me, him and I talked about a book, and he was like, what would provide hope for people during this time? And I was like, I actually think it's important to look to the past and see how did people who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago endure what they endured and what they went through. And I started looking through and studying the legacies of Black people globally. And I drew a lot of inspiration from someone like Ida B. Wells, who was a
Mm,
journalist in the 1800s, and she wrote about all of the lynchings that were taking place in the US at the time, right? And I
such a
think
cool
about how
story.
she wrote, she wrote, and her office building that she was working in at one point ended up being blown up. And she was targeted for the writing that she did and how she was able to still endure. She still decided to continue to write. Or someone like, I briefly mentioned her in the book, but someone even like Nicole Hannah-Jones, who wrote the 1619 Project, and she was attacked. She did this even, I think it was 2018 or 2019 is when the 1619 Project came out. And she got attacked. She was denied tenure at, I believe it was UNC, and she received a lot of vitriol, but she still decided to continue to do her work. And so, how did the people who experienced resistance before we even came onto this earth, how did they navigate what they
Hmm.
were going through, and what can we take from their journeys? And so that's what really inspired me to write this because I was like, we've been here before. This is not, everything is cyclical. This is not the first time that people have been opposed to justice and equity and civil rights, and this is not going to be the last time. So, what can we use from the legacies of people who came before us? How can we use what they did to navigate this moment? So, that's really what the book is about.
Yeah, that's so cool. And it's just, I love Ida B. Wells. We have her Barbie doll in the box.
Oh, I
Same.
didn't even know she had a Barbie doll.
Yeah. Yeah, we got the Rosa Parks, Ida B. Wells, Helen Keller. Like we really try to like the diverse representation, like a full I'm not a huge Barbie person, but when they came out with these Barbies, I was like, all right, I'm gonna support
Love
this.
that.
So
Yeah.
Ida's story is so cool. And yeah, the 1619 project that got thrown in with like CRT and all these like
Yeah.
evil tools that people didn't even know what they were. It's wild. And Janice, you had your own experience with a book like Decentering Whiteness. You became a target even. And I really appreciate how you opened the book with your own vulnerable story because I have been following you for years and I had no idea that you were targeted yourself. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, so in October of 2023, my book, Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace, came out. And in preparation for it to come out, I wrote a Forbes article around some of the topics I discussed. So I think the original title of the article was like Three Ways Whiteness is Centered in the Workplace, or something like that. And I wrote it, and nothing really happened. I wrote it right before the book came out. Nothing really happened. And around Thanksgiving of 2023, I started getting an uptick of like, I'm sure you get emails sometimes from people who disagree with what you write. And so I started getting a lot more trolling on my social media than usual. And I'm like, someone must have posted something somewhere because I'm getting a lot of trolls. And I get Google alerts on my name. And so anytime I'm mentioned, I get something in my inbox. And I saw something about like a US senator mentioned me. And so I clicked the link and I was like, JD Vance tweeted about me. And I went to Twitter and I saw that Forbes had tweeted the article, right? They randomly, I don't know what goes into their decision making of like what to post, they very rarely like post some of my articles, right?
Yeah.
But they had posted this one on their Facebook, on their LinkedIn, and on their Twitter. And on Twitter, I guess it had gone viral because when I checked it, maybe a few months ago, it had like 8 or 9 million views. And people like JD Vance saw it, people like Vivek Ramaswamy saw it, and a lot of people who are anti-DEI saw it. And JD Vance tweeted about it, and he was like, "This is BS. We're going to investigate. I've directed my office to investigate the DEI consultant who wrote this." The tweet is still up, right? But if you look up JD Vance and Janice Gassam Asare, I think the articles will pop up. But when that happened, then Fox News reached out to me and they were like, "Do you have a quote?" And I gave them a quote, and I was basically like, "It's obvious that the senator doesn't know what decentering whiteness actually means. Whiteness is a system. It's not about white people." And I'm like, if he read the book, he would see that I've talked about ways I've centered whiteness and I'm not a white person. So that's basically what I said. And so it snowballed because after that happened, then him and two other US senators came together and they reached out to two of the federal clients that I've worked with and they demanded to know what the nature of our relationships were. And all of this was happening while I was pregnant, while I was
Oh
in
my
my first
gosh, so
trimester. And so I
stressful.
did not think that like all of these things would be happening together, right? It was also October 7th had just happened. And so there was a lot of just stuff that was it was just a lot going on all at once. And I kind of started to retreat. And I decided I wasn't, after December of 2023, I stopped promoting decentering whiteness in the workplace because I just was, it was just a lot. And I just was like, let me focus on being pregnant and having this child. I wasn't sharing my pregnancy on social media. So people didn't even know that I was
Mm.
going through that. And, when I started writing Rise and Resist, I worked with the same editor and he's like, why, after you went through all of that, do you want to write another book? Like,
These problems. And so focusing on resistance and these stories of resistance with your own personal story. I mean, that is so wild to think. Janice, one thing I think about is like 3 years ago, you and I had a conversation about decentering whiteness. And now we feel like that's too bold. And that's what I'm worried about is like we're going obviously backwards, that something that was safe to talk about is perceived to be not safe by some, not by you and I, but externally it puts kind of a target on you. But as you document in the book, there's been all sorts of times, like you said, where we faced resistance like this before. It's almost like the more successful you are in challenging the hierarchy and the systems of power, like the more you're going to be targeted because it's working. You're doing something that's working, that's effective. And I love how every chapter is a strategy. And so I thought maybe if you could just spend some time like talking about how did you decide like what strategies? Like did the stories you found in history drive it? Or was it your own personal journey? Or was it just, what you found to be a pattern? I'm just so curious how you decided the resistance strategies.
Yeah, there were people that really resonated with me. I wanted to mostly highlight people that were lesser known because I feel like in school, I remember, I grew up in Virginia and I remember learning about Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and like the same people. And I wanted this book to be highlight people that a lot of people didn't necessarily know about. So I was like, there are people who I really resonate with. Like Ida B. Wells is somebody that I think about her often, probably because you and I are writers. So I'm always thinking like
Yeah,
she did
totally.
what she did. Right. But when I would tell people I was writing this book, people always said, "Oh, you should include this person and you should include that person." And I was starting to get so overwhelmed because I was like, there's so many people I want to include. And I think it might have been my editor or something who said, just include the people that resonate most with you. You don't have to, this
Hmm.
doesn't have to be an exhaustive list of every single person, but just include the people whose stories resonate most with you. So that's who was in the book. It's people who, when I read their stories or when I know what I knew about their stories, it was very inspiring to me. Not saying that someone like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks is not
We
inspiring, but I
know. We know
they're
already. Yeah.
exactly. I think their journeys are more known. And so I really wanted to look at people who maybe we've heard their names before, but they're a little bit lesser known, like someone like Toni Morrison, who we're like,
Mm.
okay, we know her work, but maybe we don't know a little bit more about her. So that's really
Mhm.
what went into the decision of which people to choose for the book.
Oh, another one, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye has been on my bookshelf. It was one of my first books I ever bought, I think in college. I really appreciated like maybe this class was ahead of its time. Women's studies was all intersectionality focused, and I
Mhm.
minored in it like a big dork. And
Oh, that's awesome that did you have to read the book in that
yeah,
class?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah. Or maybe I read an article by her and I was like, ooh, that sounds really interesting. And I have the book and it's blue and it's on my bookshelf behind me. Maybe I'll put your book right beside it as
yeah.
a
Yeah, because she's great and that's a great book. So like someone like that where people may be like, I don't think I had to read any Toni Morrison in school. So it's like some people may not have learned, they might be familiar with her name in
Mhm.
passing, but I really wanted people to be like, ooh, her work sounds interesting. Let me dive a little bit
Mhm.
more into her and what she's about. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's so important to like highlight these somewhat known, but not as broadly known as they should be. And of course, women of color have historically been under-amplified and, higher expectations than other groups. And so what I really appreciate is like a centering of those stories and the threads that you can pull from all of those stories. Because when I think about strength, I think a lot about Black women in particular, and those stories all speak to stories of strength and resistance. And this has been sadly so commonplace in Black women's lives. And so I think about that as a white woman doing this work is like looking at my sisters and thinking like, what can I learn? Because I'm kind of going bonkers right now. And this is somewhat new to me. I have that whiteness that's been centered and I didn't ask for it, but it still is my lived experience. And so I love this kind of recentering and reamplification of these stories that we should all know, but for sad reasons we don't. Um, and Janice, I wanted to turn that to like the strategy. So it sounds like the people that inspired you became like source material. How did you pick like which resistant strategies to use, like based on the narratives that you found?
Mhm. I think I figured out who I wanted to include, and then I tried to look at and categorize the ways that these individuals resisted into different categories. And those changed because there were a few people who were in multiple categories, right? Like one of the chapters is about how exiting can be a way to resist, right? Exiting an environment or workplace that is harmful. Sometimes just our mere presence and then exiting that environment can be a catalyst for change. And so there was somebody, Derek Bell, who I talked about throughout the book, and I was like, well, he used exiting as a way to resist, where in order to oppose, for example, Black women not getting tenure at Harvard or women of color not getting tenure at many of the other universities he was at, he would leave the university or take a leave of absence or exit. So that was his way to resist. But I also wanted to include him, and there was another chapter I wanted to include him in. So I struggled with that, right? I mentioned him briefly, but then I was like, wait, like Nina Simone is another one who she's in the storytelling as resistance because she used her music to like speak to what was happening at the time, right, in the country. But I also wanted to put her in Exit as Resistance because in the 70s, she moved to France because of all of the
Yeah.
racial turmoil that was happening in the US. And so I was like, but she's also Exit. But I guess I was like, okay, which category do they fit best in? Right? Because I can mention them. So I think that was hard. And I really thought about like, how do I make this applicable, right?
Mhm.
How do people read this and say, I can do this too? And so that also helped me narrow down who to focus on. I think the hardest chapter was, I think it was chapter 7, where I talked about all of these different leaders of countries and how their, I guess, push for self-determination, how they try to help their countries become sovereign and become free nations. And that was hard to pull out of because it seems like if you're talking about somebody who was the leader of a country, someone might read that and say, I can't relate to that. I don't lead a country. And so that was, I really tried to distill and pull out the lessons, which is like, you don't have to lead a country. If you're in a position of power, which these people were, whether it's in your community or in your workplace, you can use that power to advocate for change and to push for more equity and to help people to become more visible. And so I think that was what I really tried to think of is like, what if I'm reading this story for the first time, what would resonate most with somebody? Like what are the lessons to pull
Mhm.
out and try to make sure that they're relatable, I think
Mhm.
was really important because you could read about somebody and be like, Barack Obama, what do I have in common with Barack Obama? Or what
Right.
do I have in common with, this person or that person? And so I really wanted to make sure there was people could see the parallels in their own lives.
Ah, I love that comment about power. I did a lot of research like you after the election of like, what message do we need to share right now? And the feedback was a little underwhelming on my last book about people with power, how to be allies. But the number one finding I found in that, Janice, is one, people with power don't realize the power that they have because they're soaking in the power. They don't know that that's not like no one else is experiencing that same thing. And they severely underestimate their access to power and how they could use it for good, especially people in dominant group identities. Like their voice, as you and I know, heard way more differently. And these stories, I think we can see ourselves in these stories, right? Like knowing that people have went through hard things, one, I think is super validating, but two, to know that they found ways around it. And you have to be strategic. And so many of these strategies, the one you open with, and I'm just kind of curious to double click on this one. The unrecognized interest convergence. It was one of the first pages I earmarked, and I did that a lot in the book. But I did want to ask you about that question because interest convergence theory, as I recall in the book, came from Bell, who we were just talking about. And it's this idea, especially from a racial perspective, is when white people recognize the interests of people of color as similar, as common, we start to see social traction. So I was just curious, like if you could give us some optimism for the future, like how do we do this convergence? Like, because it feels like we're diverging again. It's like, how do we find our way back to each other?
Yeah, I think it's already happening right now. I think just looking at what was happening, what is still happening in Minnesota, there's
Hmm.
a lot of people who, because of their privilege, because of how they grew up, because of their community, they were living in a bubble. They didn't realize that racial harm and racial terror is something that people actually experienced. And unfortunately, it took the brutal murders of white people for many white people to say and realize, okay, this is a problem for all of us, right? Even though there's many people, many Black people who've been saying this for years, I think that's a
It
perfect
had to
example.
get closer to home. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so people are realizing now, like, okay, this is something that is impacting all of us, right? And so
Hmm.
I do think that people are seeing that it's not just people from underrepresented racial groups. It's not just Black people or Latin Americans or this group or that group that's going to be impacted. ICE is primarily targeting, right, in Minnesota, the Somali community, or in some of these blue states, it's mostly Latin Americans, but there's also Black immigrants who are being targeted. There's
Hmm.
also white people who are standing up for these communities that are being targeted, right? And so I do think that what this moment is teaching people, if they didn't already know, is that all of our oppressions are interconnected. And the
Yep.
same way that they surveil immigrant communities is the same tools that they're using to surveil citizens. And so the faster we realize that and we come together as a community and build coalitions, I think the better off we will be at resisting. Right. But I think that the powers that be is really good at convincing us that we're all enemies and that we're not on the same side. And when in actuality, across party lines, across racial lines, we have a lot more in common than we think that we do.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for reminding me about Minnesota. Gosh, that feels like forever ago already.
Um,
And I was hoping, I was like, which one of these murders is going to get people's attention? Not that you want these bad things to happen to good people, but you kind of waiting for a next George Floyd moment. And that was just so galvanizing and so unique. And wondering what it takes to shake people again. And it just has to really hit so close to home on so many levels. And we've just been so desensitized these last few years to these horrible tragedies. So no, I appreciate you framing it that way. That's helpful. All right, as we wrap up, I had one curious question for you about the book. So you found all these amazing people, all these amazing stories to put in here, and all the tools, like you said, storytelling, exiting, amplify, all these wonderful stories with resistance tools. What do you think if you had to pick one? What's your favorite?
I would definitely say Georgia Gilmore. She's in the chapter 5, I believe, is resistance behind the scenes. And she was somebody who she was a cook. And what she ended up doing in the 1950s during the Montgomery bus boycott, as she was baking goods, she came together with other women and they were just baking goods, baking like cakes and pies and selling them. And then she used the money that she made to sell the baked goods to support people who were participating in the Montgomery bus boycott. So people who were carpooling or who were refusing to take the bus
Hmm.
service, right? And so that story to me is so powerful because it's so simple, right? It's not like somebody leading a country or somebody who's necessarily in a quote unquote position of power that we would think of, but it's somebody that used their gifts and used the tools that
Hmm.
they had to resist, right? And so I think that if you're somebody who's maybe good at graphic design, one thing you could do is use your gifts to create flyers for maybe a local protest or something that is happening, right? Or you can, what I love seeing in Minnesota was there were these Somali women who were bringing tea to the
Mm.
protesters, right? Because we know that in
It was
Minnesota at that
freezing.
time, it was below zero temperatures. They were bringing tea and bringing food to protesters. That was something so simple. I saw a salon owner in Minnesota allowing people to come into her salon to just get a reprieve from the cold. And it's just those are small, small things. So I would definitely say Georgia Gilmore was probably my favorite story and the most inspiring because her story was something each of us can do. We all have gifts, and she used her gifts in such a simple but such a powerful way to resist.
Mm. Oh, I love that. Yeah, baking. Yeah, opening your doors to folks. Those are great practical examples because so many people I talk to feel so powerless. Like, I don't want this, but I don't know what to do. I can't do anything. And we did have some success with protesting last summer. I'm hoping that gets re-energized again for this year. And I love those thoughts to leave our listeners with of like, where could you help? Yeah, like the graphic design example. I've really thought about that in my new local community. Like, how do I plug in? I don't necessarily want to be the person behind the microphone, but how I've thought about it, Janice, is I know how to write good material for someone else to share behind the microphone. So, like, could I do some speaking coaching with local folks and help them share their voice and make sure the message is delivered? So, we all have our gifts. Like, think about your gifts. Think about what brings you joy and bring it to voicing against this because this isn't, we are not powerless. We're being led to think that we're powerless and that you don't give up your power. Like, we're not going to give up. Um,
Exactly. They want us to feel like we're powerless. And I think that will help them achieve us giving up our power and saying, we're not going to vote, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, because none of these things matter. When in actuality, they do, and they recognize the power, especially when we come together.
yeah. Yeah. The power of allies, all of us together. And yes, thank you for continuing to show up in this world. And I'm so thankful for the book. I'm so thankful for your voice. I'm so thankful for the vulnerability of you sharing your own story. And yeah, we're in it together.